I am proud to introduce Michael Meyer himself to give us an overview of his book. Michael is a distinguished author. He's a Fulbright Scholar, a Guggenheim Fellow, the winner of the Berlin Prize and Whitling Award. He has also received fellowships from the National Endowment for Humanities, the Cullman Centre, MacDowell, and the University of Oxford Centre for Life Writing. He has written for many outlets, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, and he's a professor of English at the University of Pittsburgh. And so now I'll hand you over to Michael, please.
Hey, thank you, Megan. I just have to say to start, I love the promo code at Waterstones. That made my week. Thank you for that. It's an incredible honor to be speaking to you all tonight. As you can see, maybe I'm in Berlin. I'm on Wannsee, on a lake outside of the central city. I'm in my writing studio right now, where I'm here working on a book, but I'm so happy to get to talk to all of you tonight about this remarkable person, Annie Besant, and this really groundbreaking, unprecedented trial, which unfortunately is still too topical today. I'm happy to take all of your questions after this. As Megan noted, we're supposed to end at 8, but I'm happy to stay past that. I always like hearing from readers. I'm going to share a screen now and show you slides. I'm going to give you an overview of the book, sort of the arc of the story and the characters who appear on the stage and the conflict at the heart of it all through a series of slides here that will last about 15, 16 minutes. And then I'll join Bob in a conversation. So first, I'm going to share screen. There you see my son Benji enraptured at the Bruegel Gallery in Vienna. But let me pull up my slides here, and we'll start with the book title, the cover itself. I'm assuming you can all see this. I will go to slideshow. You see the poster here of the cover of the book is meant to look like a wanted poster. Annie didn't have the dignity of a wanted poster, but she very much was public enemy #1 in 1877. I think when you write a book, the first question people often ask you is, how did you come upon this subject? Why did you choose to write this book? It was really happenstance. My book before this was about Benjamin Franklin and his last will and testament, and his notion to keep giving money long beyond after his passing to train trade workers, people who didn't want to have a 4-year degree, who wanted to go into carpentry or masonry. And that money is still paying out in America today. It's still funding 18 and 19-year-olds, many of them immigrants, who do not want a 4-year degree, but want to study a trade. So while I was writing that book, I thought I'd go to Franklin's ancestral hometown, which is in the village of Ecton, where his father had emigrated from. And to get to Ecton, I had to drive through Northampton. And as I did that, I came across this statue. And I thought, why is there a statue of Marlon Brando sitting in this middle of the city? I think that was so odd. And as one does, you pull over and you look at the plinth, at the plaque, and it was a person named Charles Bradlaugh, who, as an American, I had never heard of. And I'm sure everyone on this Zoom tonight, of course, knows who Bradlaugh is. So I won't spend a lot of time rehashing him. But as I was, sitting there reading about Bradlaugh under the glare of the sun, I noticed a pub called the Charles Bradlaugh. So I went over there and I said, oh, Charles Bradlaugh, what an interesting person. And the publican, the guy behind the bar, said, yeah, I don't know much about him. We just like the name because he was an MP here. And a lot of the bootmakers in this district had voted for him. He knew that. And so as one does, I started Googling Bradlaugh when I was sitting in the pub. And you find that in 1880, of course, he's not allowed to take his seat in Parliament because he refuses to swear an oath to God. He wants to be recognized by his own recognizance. And this is the beginning of the long battle over what would become the Oaths Act. And as I was sitting there reading this, one of the pictures that came up on my phone was this wonderful image of Bradlaugh. And here's his daughter, Hypatia, who's, of course, a very important figure in National Secular Society history as well. And they're sitting in the prison room of what is today the Elizabeth Tower underneath Big Ben. And I thought, well, that's really funny. I never knew there was a prison cell in Big Ben before. And during the course of the research of this book, I actually got to go inside this cell. And here's what it looks like today. And I rather like that if you look at the engraving from 1880, you see the wallpaper and the mantle and the fireplace and the bars on the window. And when you visit it today, it pretty much looks unchanged. The furniture is a bit better. There's also two people sitting here, just like in the engraving, which I loved. So as I was reading about Charles, of course, the notion of, his partner in crime, Annie Besant, kept coming up. And I thought, well, why have I never heard of Annie Besant before? Who's this? And it turns out that on this night that Bradlaugh was imprisoned in the clock tower, Annie had rushed down to be with him. This is high Victorian polities here, so they had dinner together. And Annie was the one who was fielding these telegraphs and telegrams of support to Bradlaugh about keep up the fight, don't swear your oath to God. And I'm just showing you this to begin because I think it's probably the last time in history a telegram was addressed to Clock Tower, House of Commons in London. And, the more I read about Bradlaugh, I realized he has a lot of books written about him. He's pretty well known, I think, in British history, or at least in Victorian history, to the point where if you go to Kensal Green, there's the Reformers Memorial here with all these great Victorians who fought for social justice and equity. And Josephine Butler's name is on here. She fought against the Contagious Diseases Act. And Millicent Fawcett, of course, is on here, and on and on and on. But there's a big space missing right here. And I thought, well, that's odd. Why does Bradlaugh get all this attention, but Annie Besant doesn't? Why don't we know anything about her? And why is it when you go to Parliament Square, you see a statue of Millicent Fawcett, who was born the same year as Annie Besant, born in 1847, which, by the way, was the same year the Bronte sisters published Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre, but they did so under male pen names. This was the world they were born into. And when Millicent Fawcett and Annie Besant were in London as young women in their 20s, the only statues of women they would have seen were either of Queen Victoria or Queen Mary. There's no other representations of women, of course. And I was really shocked, too, when I started thinking about doing this book, that on the plinth underneath Miss Fawcett here, there's a long honor roll of early suffragists, people who fought for women's right to vote. And Annie Besant is not on this either, even though her first public speech in London, and her first public speech in general, was on the political status of women. So I thought, okay, well, this is interesting. Something's missing from our history here. And even when, this is what Annie looked like, by the way, around the time of the trial. She's not yet 30. She's 29 years old in her great entry to the public stage. But when you go to probably the site of her, the thing she's best known for in modern British history, or our telling of it, this is the Bryant and May Match Factory in London's East End in Bow. And when I first visited this is where she helped lead the largest collective walkout of women laborers in British history to that point, led by Sarah Chapman, who went and found Annie's help, and she propagandized for them and raised money for them and really raised a hue and cry and publicized their cause. When I first went to the East End to look at this factory, there was a plaque hanging, an unofficial blue plaque here, hanging above the gate. And it talked about the legacy of the strike, that it was led here by Annie Besant, which again is a bit off because Sarah Chapman and the other female workers were really the ones who led the strike. She publicized it. But I was struck right, within a year of visiting this is right around COVID time, 2021, after our first pause in COVID, that plaque had been removed and it had been replaced with an official English heritage plaque that just says the Match Girl strike took place here at the Bryant and May Works in 1888. Just magically happened. No one was actually leading it or in charge of it. And I thought, okay, there's something going on here. Annie is hiding in plain sight for her role in British history, and yet we're not honoring her or recognizing her. And I should say Annie does have a blue plaque, but it's in South London. It's on a cottage that she fled to when she left her abusive vicar husband with her young daughter, Mabel, and her mother came to live with her. They only lived here a few months before she moved to a rented accommodation after she had joined the National Secular Society, which I'll talk about in a second. And when you go and visit this cottage, it's very ill-kept. And her name is actually, concealed behind these vines, which is more than a metaphor, I think. Only 14% of blue plaques honor women in London, which is a shockingly low number. And I'm just really struck again that there isn't a really great modern biography of Annie. She's not honored by a statue. There's a street, there's Annie Besant Close you can visit in the East End of terraced council housing. But other than that, she's sort of vanished. In India, she's a better remembered, and I'll talk about that at the end of how she's memorialized in India. But again, most Indians, I think, would not know that Annie led the charge for the right for women's bodily autonomy or the right to read about, let alone purchase, contraception. She's very much the first in that. You know, as a writer, people always ask, like, how do you know when it's time to write a book? The answer is it's time to write a book when the book you want to read doesn't exist. And for me, it was this trial of 1877, where Annie was charged with obscenity for knowingly and willingly and brazenly publishing an American birth control pamphlet. And this is the pamphlet in question. You see her initials on the top of it there. This is the copy that she used during her trial. This is at the Wellcome Collection off Euston Road there. And, you know, an 1877 reader, fruits of philosophy would have been pretty clear what it meant. Fruits being a byword here for reproduction. Philosophy was a byword for science. So it's the science of reproduction, an essay on the population question by Dr. Charles Knowlton. This book had been published by a doctor in America in the 1830s. He was a rural country doctor, Charles Knowlton. Here's our man Charles, looking nothing like a man who was convicted of grave robbing, I assure you. In fact, Charles was convicted of grave robbing, which wasn't that odd in 1830s America, but in order to finance his medical education at Dartmouth, he would dig up bodies and sell them to anatomists for dissection. And Dr. Knowlton, before he was a doctor, was actually convicted of this and jailed for that. But when he was a doctor in the 1830s, he had several female patients come to him and say they don't want to have a 6th or 7th or 8th child. And so Knowlton decided he was going to write a short, simple to read, easy to use birth control pamphlet. Wasn't called birth control at the time. That term was coined by Margaret Sanger in the 1930s. Margaret Sanger and Marie Stopes are not even born when Annie Besant is fighting her battle in 1877. And this is before, I should also add, eugenics raised its ugly head over the cause. So Annie predates all of this. Knowlton, when he made his copy of Fruits of Philosophy, he made it quite small so a woman could conceal it up her dress sleeve. He nonetheless was convicted of obscenity and served jail time in Massachusetts. And then the matter sort of went away. You know, there were other birth control pamphlets under King George that were not prosecuted in Great Britain. Francis Place had written one. Richard Carlisle, a friend of the National Secular Society, or at least Conway Hall later on, had written one, and they were not prosecuted. And in fact, Fruits of Philosophy was sold in Great Britain, published by many National Secular Society publishers for years, and it sold very poorly, 500 to 700 copies a year. But in 1876, a bookseller in Bristol was arrested for selling it because the person tending his shop had slipped pornographic images or images of nude women in between the pages and was arrested, tried, and jailed for obscenity. And so the National Secular Society member, Charles Watts, who was kind of a comrade in arms of Charles Bradlaugh at that time, he was prosecuted as the publisher of the book. And Watts said, I had no idea what was in this book. Honestly, I'd really never read it before. It didn't sell that well. And he decided to strike a plea deal, plead guilty, take a heavy fine, avoid jail time, and let the matter rest, or so he thought. Annie, however, in 1877 said, absolutely not. This is government incursion on free speech. This is a dire health issue for women in Victorian England, especially the women I work with in the East End who have 12 children, 13 children, 14 children. This is affecting the poor disproportionately. Well-to-do people, the gentry, can speak to each other about how to avoid getting pregnant, or their obstetricians. Well, they weren't officially obstetricians then. They were all men. Also could tell them ways to avoid pregnancy. But Annie said, look, it's really important that we fight this battle, and that she wanted to reprint the pamphlet itself and sell it for 6 pence. She said it's very crucial that this knowledge gets in the hands of the people who need it most. As I mentioned, she welcomed the fight, which was rare. This is 1877. She's a single mother who's left an abusive vicar at a time when laws of coverture pretty much deprive a married woman of all personal liberties. So this is Conway Hall, by the way. I'm going to talk about, or the library. I'm going to talk about in a second. Annie is choosing to wage this battle in an era when, even after the passage of the Married Women's Property Act, a woman cannot own her own property, have her own income, open her own bank account, cannot maintain custody of her child, even if she successfully wins a divorce. Has less rights, or about the same rights, as a dependent child. So Annie has her young daughter with her in London. She's 29 years old. Her abusive vicar husband has threatened to pull that child from her arms. She's all but penniless, except for the help of Moncure Conway and other National Secular Society members. And, you know, here, if you go to Conway Hall into the library, you can pull out these great issues of the National Reformer that haven't been digitized. And in them, you can turn their beautiful, creamy, thick Victorian paper. And if you turn to March 25th, 1877, you can see how brazen Annie was here. She put a full, you know, the top of the page advertisement that about the book that had already been prosecuted 2 months earlier, and I'll zoom in on it here. She not only says that they're going to republish it, but that it's going to be on sale at Stonecutter Street, and Charles and Annie will be in attendance and personally sell the first 100 copies. She very much wants to be arrested and make this a test case of free speech, and also have a platform to talk about women's health. Charles wasn't as keen on this as she was. He very much wanted to try to run again to become an MP. And of course, like I said, she had much more to lose than he did, and he kept trying to talk her out of it, but she was adamant. The other interesting thing about this is that when the police at first didn't come, Annie was very disappointed, and then brought a copy over to the police station. And when they still didn't come, she kept taunting the police in the National Reformer, saying, you know, we're going to be here, we're selling more copies, the first run of 5,000 is almost out. And finally, she found her deliverance when a detective named William Simons, who would later go on to don disguises and lead the investigation to catch the man known as Jack the Ripper, showed up, and finally, on the 5th day of April, did arrest Annie and Charles for selling an indecent, dirty book. And you can see here, this is the affidavit. I found this in the National Archives at Kew. And I should say here, in all the archives I worked in around London, every archivist kept saying, how do we not know this story? This is really interesting. And, you know, there's nothing better as a researcher when they get excited as well. So Annie was charged with unlawfully selling and publishing an obscene book. The indictment ran to about the same length as the same one that indicted Charles II. It was ridiculously thick, you know, when you read this, and all the lewd and lascivious things they were charged with. Annie made the Times of London for the first time. Here's their notice. It's in the very back of the newspaper. It sort of looks now that they kind of smuggled themselves behind enemy lines, because what the Times didn't know at this time was that not only did Annie want to get arrested, but she fully intended to defend herself. This is 1877. This is 45 years before Helena Normanton becomes the first British woman allowed to practice law in the UK. So not only is Annie 50 years ahead of Virginia Woolf's, you know, dictum that a woman needs a room of her own in which to write. Annie had her own publishing, her own printing press. She's also 45 years before the law in many ways. Annie was elated to make it into the Times. This would be one of 700 items about her over her long career. Quickly, I want to show you what was on the first page of the Times, because the Times is a big character in this book, because the publisher of the Times made sure that his son would be the foreman on the jury. So the Times would have a front row seat to this. And again, little did Annie expect public favor to swing so strongly behind her and Charles that the Times dutifully was reprinting her court testimony each day, because it was good news. It was just selling like crazy. And in fact, before the prosecution, like I mentioned, the pamphlet was selling about 700 copies a year. But between her arrest in early April and the trial date in June, it sold 133,000 copies. So the very speech that the government was trying to suppress, it only amplified. You'll notice on the front page of the Times, these are the birth notices. This is the first thing you'd see when you'd open the newspaper. And if you can see these closely enough, you'll notice, unless, you're Lady Mary Pose, the women's names don't get to be in the paper. Sophia is a rarity here as the daughter, but mostly it's the wife of so-and-so, the wife of Duncan Davidson, the wife of the Reverend, the wife of James Raisin, and so forth. And so Annie was really breaking ground too, in terms of being a woman and having her voice amplified. I mean, Millicent Fawcett should rightfully be praised for her speeches against, for suffragism, I should say, in the 1870s, because it was rare to see a woman speaking at all publicly in 1877 or 1870s London. And Annie was a rarity in that she was doing it in court in the biggest case of the land. In 5 more minutes here, let me just run through some of the central characters. This is what Annie looked like around the time of the trial. Notice her fashionable short hair and her scarf here. She sort of looks like a French revolutionary, I think, in many ways. She's going up against the establishment. I mean, there's still an issue or a debate to this day who really brought the charges. The prosecutor was the Queen. It was the state itself. It was the Queen v. Bradlaugh and Besant. But they could never really prove who was funding all of this. But the Crown certainly expected to win, because up against Annie Besant, they threw Douglas Straight, who was a young, very accomplished barrister. He's 33 years old, graduate of Harrow. He had successfully defended Bolton and Park, which was the 2 transvestite men, the cross-dressing men that were accused of soliciting sex in central London. He successfully brought them in not guilty. He was a very much a proponent of suffragism. He had unsuccessfully, as an MP, tried to raise the age of consent to 14. It was 12 at this time in the UK. And so, like a lot of these people, a lot of Victorians in general, I think Straight had a lot of different facets to his personality, which makes him fun to write about. He probably knew Annie's brother quite well. So he was the first person she was up against. But the main opposition was Lord Hardinge Giffard. And this is how he was portrayed in an editorial cartoon at the time. He was also an MP. He would become Lord Halsbury after the trial. And he was the author of Halsbury's Laws of England, which are at last count up to volume 103. I mean, he's not only the top lawyer in the UK at this time, but he's the best legal mind. He's the Solicitor General, and he's going to make sure that Annie and Charles are brought in as guilty. Hearing the case was none other than the Lord Chief Justice himself. Annie and Charles very, very masterfully argued that they should not be tried at Old Bailey, that they should instead be tried by a special jury in no less a venue than the Court of Queen's Bench, named after the monarch. Here's Victoria at this time. In 1877, by the way, she had just been made Empress of India. Here she is with the Corps-Inure Diamond. She's 58 years old at this time. And the trial is going to take place here in the Court of Queen's Bench. This faced St. Margaret's Street. So if you can picture Parliament Square today and Millicent Fawcett's statue, magnificent courtroom designed by John Soane right after he'd done Dulwich Picture Gallery. It was destroyed. It was torn down when the High Courts of Justice were built. But this is Annie's stage. She's the only woman allowed to attend the trial. And the jurors are here, all men. There's a special jury. These were banned later after World War II, but you have to be an esquire, a gentleman, a top 1% income bracket to be a special juror. They're arrayed here. Douglas Straight and Lord Hardinge Giffard are sitting here. Annie and Charles are over here. And then Lord Chief Justice Alexander Cockburn is overhearing this. I mentioned Cockburn because he's important, because he is the person that set the standard for obscenity in Great Britain. And his Hickland test from a ruling he had given earlier was the same precedent that would later bring James Joyce to trial, George Bernard Shaw to trial, D.H. Lawrence to trial, but before all of them, Annie Besant. And I might note that Annie, I think, defended herself best of all. quickly, let me wind up so we can talk a little bit and have questions. You know, Annie was magnificent in front of the jury. George Bernard Shaw called her the best orator of her time. And I just want to give you, in the book, I'm lucky that the transcripts for the trial are really thorough. And so the book is mostly Annie's voice. She stood in front of the special jury, this room full of men, and said, "I may perhaps say one word for myself before I go right into my case. The learned Solicitor General has had the kindness to say that he does not impute bad intent to me in publishing this work. What bad intent could there be? I had nothing to gain in publishing this book. I have everything to lose. It is no light thing for a woman whose ambition is bound up in the name which she hopes to make, to have the imputation thrown upon her of publishing indecent books and of disseminating obscenity amongst the young. I risk my name, I risk my liberty. It is not without deep and earnest thought that I have entered into this struggle." And finally, to needle Sir Hardinge Giffard and the prosecution, she said, "I want to remind the jury, people buy this book now simply because it is prosecuted." Now, before I end here, I also want to give Annie recognition for something else that was very clever. She called witnesses to testify on her behalf that the birth control pamphlet was not dirty, but in fact was scientific. She asked Charles Darwin to appear, and Darwin, perhaps unsurprisingly, said, "No way am I going to do that. Birth control is abhorrent to my theory of natural selection. We need to keep reproducing so the weak die off and the strong survive." So instead, Annie asked Alice Vickery, who later would become an important member of her social circle and of secularism in general. She's George Drysdale's partner. They were never officially married, but they were common law husband and wife. Vickery had not yet qualified as a doctor because there were no hospitals or medical schools that would accept women at this time. And so instead, Alice Vickery went to Paris. And Alice Vickery, when she testified, is also the first woman to testify in this court in its long history, you know, really kind of gave it to the jury and the audience that the French were really enlightened about this stuff. And why couldn't British men be the same? Why do you need 12, 13, 14 children? Why is marital rape seen as being acceptable? I mean, she was really defiant and interesting on the stand, and she's an important character in this book as well. Now, I want to go to Q&A, so I'm just going to wrap up with 3 more images. At the end, I don't want to give a spoiler alert here, but I think Annie was very masterful in her defense. And she thought that the jury was going to easily find in her and Bradlaugh's favor. Sir Alexander Cockburn, in summing up, felt that Annie had made her case better than the Crown's prosecution team. He also felt they were going to easily win. But instead, and I just want to read to you from the National Reformer, this is after the verdict is announced. Annie writes, "Our speeches have been read literally by millions whom we could never have otherwise reached. The Times gave admirable reports throughout, and I do not complain of its bitter hostility. It is the organ of British Philistinism and reflects the feeling which howls a man down in one generation for doing what it will applaud in the next. The Times of 1900 will praise us as heroes, and we must not grumble at the Times of 1877. As for the special jurors," Besant wrote, "the 12 men had, quote, been very quiet, very attentive, very patient. The only explanation of their verdict is that they were also very stupid." Because in the end, they tried to have it both ways. The jury announced that they found that the birth control pamphlet, was in fact obscene, but it absolved Besant and Bradlaugh of any ill intent in publishing it. Sir Alexander Cockburn, the Lord Chief Justice, put his hand in his hands. He couldn't believe how stupid they were. He said, "Gentlemen, you cannot have it both ways. You've now brought them in guilty." One of the things Cockburn did, however, was release Annie and Charles on their own recognizances. And as the appeal went through the motions, he told Annie, you know, if you could just promise to stop publishing the Laws of Population, this can all go away. So Annie did promise to stop publishing the Laws of Population. And I just want to show you that in the end, though, she published her own birth control book instead. and took advertisements for better and safer birth control devices and put those in there, including the pessary, what would be called a diaphragm today. She was really rebellious to the core. Finally, you know, Charles rode their notoriety straight into Parliament. He was elected, that's where I started these slides, and would eventually see through the Oaths Act and be allowed to take his seat. And I think was a very popular parliamentarian, kind of got co-opted by the very establishment he had fought against. Where Annie, on the other hand, was kind of thrown aside, and the fracture in their relationship began shortly after his first imprisonment, or actually his imprisonment in the clock tower in 1880. This is from the Bishopsgate Institute, and looking at an editorial cartoon that Hypatia had saved from this time. And you see Charles is sick of Inspector Denning. He was the police officer here for the Houses of Parliament. Annie is sick of sewing coattails, because as Charles's fame rose, Annie really was pushed aside in many ways. And unfortunately, her husband, her estranged husband, the vicar, used the notoriety of their trial and their, you know, guilty verdict, which is no other way around it, to claim full custody of Mabel. And even though Annie would go on to fight other causes, including the Match Girls strike, here we are in 1888, she was deprived of Mabel, and Frank Besant, her husband, Besant, excuse me, had custody of both her children. And I just want to end here, though, that it's really funny, you know, as the book traces the end of Annie's career and her activism, we follow her to her election on the London School Board, and then eventually her move to India and her embrace of Theosophy. And she becomes the first female president of the National Congress in India, which is the Independence Party, becomes friends with Mohandas Gandhi. They too will later have a falling out. But I want to end this on a hopeful note here, and it's with this clipping, the last item in Bradlaugh's file, actually, at the Bishopsgate Institute. Charles died in 1891. His will was only about 36 lines, and even though he and Annie had split, 13 of those lines were about his love for her and his respect for her and the hope that NSS members would help her and support her, whatever she does. And then there's this nice little item at the end of the file from 1890, which is that when Mabel turned 18, she came home to her mother. And then their son Digby, when he turned 18, he also renounced his inheritance and any claims from his father, and also came back to Annie. And so in the end, you know, many of Annie's victories were Pyrrhic in nature. She at least succeeded, I think, in reuniting her family. And also, you know, we'll go back to that Times quote that what newspapers of 1877 abhorred, in 1900 were applauding. And I think she'd find many similarities in our world today. So I will stop there, and I'm happy to go into conversation with Bob, and of course, to take all your questions. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Michael, for that overview. And I have to stress, it really is a summary. There is so much more in this book. There really is. You know, when I read it, I'm no historian myself. I was so struck by how vivid it is, how much context there is for someone like me who is, you know, really ought to know a bit more about British history. I thought it was really useful to have that. And it's interesting you raised Queen Victoria, because you throughout the book, you kind of show the parallel lives between what Queen Victoria was doing at the same time what Annie Besant was going through these trials, and how different their lives were. So yeah, and the style of your book as well is just it's just as lively, and you know, I think that the word that comes to mind, rock and roll style, that you've been presenting it tonight. So yeah, it's such a good read. So yes, now I will hand over to first Bob Forder, to maybe just give a little bit more information about the importance of Annie Besant and of course the Dirty Filthy Book to the National Secular Society. So Bob, do you want to come back on any of these points that Michael's made?
Well, I was going to start, Megan, by trying to express what a lively, interesting book this was, but I feel that job has been done. So I'll pass over quietly, but as far as I was concerned, when I read it, it hummed along. I think one particular strength might be worth mentioning is that for the general reader, rather than the trained historian, this book is a good read. And one of the reasons it's a good read is that Michael does a splendid job of placing the whole thing in the historical context. He relates it to what was going on in the country at large. And that does help the understanding of it. Now, I'm bound to put my NSS hat on here and point out that the NSS was founded in 1866. As such, it is certainly the oldest campaigning pressure group extant in the UK today. But in truth, for the first 10 years or so, it didn't really have much of a public profile. But then this trial came along and everything changed. And now people knew what the NSS was, what was going on, and they knew about Bradlaugh and Besant. Bradlaugh, for example, would be very much a sort of working class London politician, but now he became nationally well known. As Michael so rightly says, this was part of the backdrop to his election to Parliament in 1880, and also the ferocious opposition to his actually taking his seat, because he was associated with what many people regarded as still as a scandalous piece of literature. Finally, and this is the final point I want to make, the trial and the book draw attention to two fundamental, seminal issues which the NSS campaigns on, but are still vitally important today. In fact, I feel they're becoming more important as each day passes. What I'm referring to is freedom of speech and publication, and the whole issue of bodily autonomy, which are very much live issues today. So thank you, Michael. Thank you for your book, and I really do recommend it.
Thank you, Bob.
Thanks a lot, Bob. Okay, so I can see that we're already getting questions in, which is fantastic, but I do want to ask a few myself first, and then maybe Michael, you can answer, and then Bob, if you have anything to pitch in, please do. So the first thing I wanted to ask was something about something specific that you've said in the book, which was that the quantum leap, as he called it, that Besant made was legitimizing contraception as worthy of public discussion and morally permissible to practice at home. At the NSS, we think this is a really important point, but could you please expand on that?
Yes. It's always difficult when you're writing about a character. You don't want to fall in love with them or get too close to them. But I have to say, I admire Annie so much. And I know some of this is happenstance and so forth. She grasped early on that if she could argue this issue in the newspapers, this is at a time when there's 406 publications weekly, at least in London alone. This is the high age of Victorian paper. And she knew if she could get her voice in this issue in print, that with that megaphone, public opinion was going to very quickly turn and back her. And she was right, because what she did is by going through the motion, rather than standing at Speaker's Corner, let's say, or putting out a 2-penny pamphlet or whatnot, by being in the highest court of the land, arguing before the highest judge in the land, and having the establishment newspapers, as well as working class newspapers, report her words, she was getting them on breakfast tables and dinner tables from Belfast to Plymouth to Aberdeen. I mean, it's amazing the scope all of a sudden that she was, the outreach she was having. And then beyond that, just the letters of support that came pouring in for her from working class people, including clergy members. And I think one of the great sort of Phillips of the book at the end is when Annie does have a moment to sort of sit back and harumph, as it were, because one of the leading church publications of the 1890s wrote that, you know, it actually is Christian to limit family size and reduce the strain on women, and you should only have the number of people in your family that you can support, you know, live within your means and so forth. And she said, it's a remarkable that within a generation, even the church had come around to this. And again, this was at a time when Victoria had 9 children in 17 years. And Megan, you mentioned earlier that I contrast Victoria to Annie's life throughout this, because Victoria's diaries are such great reads. She was such a great writer. And the Victoria in her diary is a very different person, of course, than the Victoria that's on stage. And what you learn through her diary is that while she loved having sex, she really hated the consequences of it, right? Albert was, it sounded like a very sensitive, wonderful partner, but she hated being pregnant and she hated the effects on her body. She gained a ton of weight. She could no longer dance. She had a prolapsed uterus. She had a ventral hernia. You know, and she kept writing to her daughters, if there were a way to prevent this, you know, other than the men's self-interest or self-control. And you kept thinking, boy, if Victoria and Annie could get in the same room, they'd probably agree on some of these things. So this is a long-winded way of answering your question, Megan, just to say that she was so far ahead of her time. And you're right, it's still timely today. I mean, there are still classrooms in America, you know, in the US right now, there's Arizona, one of our states, is reviving an 1864 ban on abortion, which I know abortion and birth control are not similar things. But, you know, this war against quote unquote immorality is still going on. And it's at the effect of women's health.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. I don't know if we have anything else to add on to that, Bob.
I don't, Megan.
Okay. In that case, I'll go on to the next question that I have, which again is very much from the secularist perspective. Those who support closer ties between religion and public policy often cite the supposed unique moral insight that religion offers. And do you think that Besant and Bradlaugh's trial highlight some of the flaws of that argument?
I do. And I think it's, you know, Bob had said this, and I think we've been talking throughout this, like, it's remarkable to me at age 52, and having gone to institutions like the University of California, Berkeley, you know, the commitment to free speech and whatnot, that we still can't decide as a society what it means to live in a pluralistic, democratic commonwealth, if you will. And despite all of our awareness of multiculturalism and different opinions and science, we see this from the pandemic and whatnot, the fact that we still have people in our world today saying, no, you can't do that because religion says so, I think would just make Annie stomp her boots and pick a new fight, pick a new trial to have. Yeah. Because it changes, doesn't it? It changes constantly. Yeah. And my son is 12 years old, and you know, there's so much that he takes for granted. And I keep saying, you know, in the 90s, if you had told me that gay people could get married, I would have said, are you crazy? Like, we change so quickly as a society and go, yes, that's right. I can't believe we ever thought that before. And yet on women's health and, you know, birth control and contraception remains the most cost-effective, easiest way to help women's health. And we still can't get over that hurdle. It's still a fight. Yeah.
I certainly couldn't have put it better myself in terms of the you know, the relevance of a secularist viewpoint on this. I don't know if you can add to that at all, Bob, or
no. I noticed one of the questions that has been typed out there is, what does all this say about the idea of progress?
Of progress?
Yes. What does
good question, right?
Yeah. And I'm not sure I know the answer.
Well, I will say, you know, can Annie answer that? Let's let Annie answer that, because one thing that struck me as writing this book was that these rights that we take for granted are not carved in stone. We have to defend them. We have to continually fight against them, or fight to protect them, I should say. And this is something, of course, why the National Secular Society exists. I just want to end with a quote from Annie. She was often asked, who will help? And she wrote, plenty of people wish well to any good cause, but very few care to exert themselves to help it, and still fewer will risk anything in its support. Someone ought to do it, but why should I? is the ever re-echoed phrase of weak-kneed amiability. Someone ought to do it, so why not I? Is the cry of some earnest servant of man, eagerly forward springing to face some perilous duty. Between those two sentences lie whole centuries of moral evolution. And she wrote that in 1878. You go, yeah, I just admit that we all have to remember this, you know, that the clock of progress only keeps ticking if we keep winding it. Otherwise, it will halt.
Or goes backwards.
Right, or go backwards, right.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I think that that's actually a good point to get some of the audience questions. I think it's a great time to move on to this. So let's have a look. So we've got Barathi MG says, wonderful talk. Can you please talk a bit more about Annie's conversion to Theosophy? Did her position on birth control and population go through change after she embraced Theosophy? Really interesting question.
A fantastic question, and I get asked all the time, why did Annie embrace Theosophy? I think she embraced Theosophy because at heart she was spiritual. You know, she was raised in the church. She very much wanted to be a vicar's wife and succor the poor and work in her community. One of her first books was about red letter saints, people that didn't have official black letter days. I'm sorry, black letter saints, those who didn't have red letter days on the liturgical calendar. I think she just felt heard by Madame Blavatsky, who was the founder of Theosophy. You know, Annie was around men in all of these fights she was having, and she was often, she felt like a third or even fourth wheel, that men were running the show and she was sidelined. And with Madame Blavatsky, she felt very much heard and present. And I think that it felt true to her, and it really rocked Charles. Charles could not accept this. Well, why would he? He was an official atheist. But Annie saw a forward path of progress. I mean, we can come back to this. She thought it really was going to be something that could unite the world together in commonality rather than division. The effect on her birth control campaign was, of course, that she renounced her teachings, and that Theosophy said that birth control was preventing the rebirth of souls, believed in reincarnation. And so she smashed the plates for her own birth control book. It didn't stop the movement. It didn't stop their sales. It didn't stop doctors in the Netherlands and in Australia from opening birth control clinics using her teachings. But she renounced it all and said that that's no longer my work. I can no longer advocate for birth control. And my path forward now is in Theosophy. And she eventually became head of the organization, you know, when she was living in India, and there's a school that still exists in Ojai in the mountains outside of Los Angeles. It's called the Besant Hill School now. That's on property that she originally had bought with the Theosophy Society money. You can visit the lodge that she and Madame Blavatsky had used. It's on 19 Avenue Road. It's being redone right now around the northern edge of Regent's Park. And I just want to add here a quick button. The day I'd finished the research of this book, I came back to my rented flat in Bayswater. And when I opened the door in the darkness, I looked down and there was a piece of paper that someone had slipped under the door. And when I picked it up, it was an invitation to a Theosophy study session in Queensgate Gardens. And I laughed and I thought, okay, Annie, you got me. You know, I didn't know that the Theosophists still met in London, but of course they do. There's a center in Queensgate Gardens that you can go to.
Brilliant.
Do you think, Michael, somebody once said that Annie was looking for truth?
Yeah.
She was searching for a truth.
Yeah.
And perhaps as she worked her way through free thought, secularism, and science, you worked out that science perhaps doesn't actually get you to the truth. It just means more questions.
You know, I'm glad you brought up the science part, Bob. This is a part of the book that, you know, after the trial, she thought she might go into academia. And you're right, she studied under T.H. Huxley, who was Darwin's bulldog at that time. And later, Huxley's grandson, Aldous Huxley, author of Brave New World, would contribute money for the Besant Hill School in LA and help her buy that property. But she was not allowed to enroll formally at University College London because the university said, if people know that Annie Besant's on our student roll, donors are going to pull their checks. And so she felt completely shut out. She had scored the highest marks on some of the entrance exams. She thought she was going to sit for these great classes with Huxley, who had initially supported her, but then it turned out behind closed doors and said, don't let her in. And so you're right. I think she could move through these different phases, starting with the Church of England, and then going into secularism and atheism, and then academia and science, and then out the other side. And, you know, she would often tell people too, she's 3/4 Irish. She was born Annie Wood. And her mom had a sort of streak of mysticism in her as well. And so maybe it wasn't so far away. You know, maybe in some ways, come to Theosophy, Annie was coming full circle, as many of us do as we age.
Right. Okay. So the next question I've got is an interesting one from Tammy Cupid. Were you inspired by the work of S. Chandrasekhar on this subject? Chandrasekhar, he's the theoretical physicist, I believe. I'm not sure what the connection
No,
is.
Chandrasekhar wrote a book called The Dirty, Filthy Book, which was a monograph by University of California Press put out in the early 80s. Now, I'm going to confess, whether listeners believe me or not, I had not read that book when I decided on the title for this book. The title for this book came from the great Daily Mirror headline, The Filth and the Fury, which was the Sex Pistols headline after they had been on the Bob Grundy show. Because when you're in the British Library and the newspaper archives, that poster, that framed headline is sitting over you as you're reading the Times and the newspapers of the 1870s. And the line, A Dirty, Filthy Book, comes from Sir Hardinge Giffard. It's what he calls the book during the trial. Now, as I'm working on this, and I decide, oh, I have this great title, this is amazing. And I sent the book proposal out, and Penguin bought it, and I was so excited. And then I went, oh my gosh, there's a monograph of this with the same title. And so then there was debate, like, should I have a comma in it? Should I not? But yes, I praise him in the acknowledgements throughout for that. That was a seminal work on this. And I think really he was the first person. Helen Taylor did a biography of Annie for University of Oxford Press in 1990. But his book was really the first that focused in on the trial. Yeah. Though I will say, and I don't want to sound too defensive about this, it's a very dry academic sort of look at, that's not a bad thing, but he's looking at it at the effect on the decrease in population over time. And he's right. I wanted to tell a story, which is, let's pretend we just opened the newspaper in 1877 London. Let's go. What's going on in the streets? What are people eating? What are they seeing at the theater? What are they wearing? What's Victoria up to? I wanted to tell a full story around this. So my book's different in that regard. Credit where credit is due, yes.
That's a great little story as well. It's always good to hear these little background stories behind these things. So another question from David Boothroyd.
Yeah.
What can we learn from the fact that the secularist movement in the 1870s was far from united behind Annie Besant and Bradlaugh in publishing birth control books?
Bob, can you take that?
Yeah, I can. I think the secularists, freethinkers, whatever you want to call us, are very quarrelsome. And it's very difficult sometimes. I suppose you're bound to get this with people who have strong opinions about such matters. And one of the great schisms, or the great schism, which in a way I think still exists today, was between Bradlaugh and his atheistic secularism and George Jacob Holyoake, who was who actually coined the term secularism, but meant something rather different from it than we use it today. His conception of secularism was much more akin to humanism, I think, whereas secularism, as the NSS defines it or understands it, is a rather narrower and political concept, concerned essentially with the separation of church and state. So this division within secularist rank has gone on, and to some extent, I think, still continues today. And it's just in the ether, I'm afraid.
I think too, Bob, I could just add on this. I was curious why, Annie had few early feminist friends. George Eliot, the novelist, warned one of her friends, don't hang out with that woman. And Eliot was seen as being very progressive for her time. She was living out of wedlock and so forth. Aside from Josephine Butler and Wollstonecraft Emmy, there weren't a lot of, and the Pankhurst family later, Emmeline Pankhurst did like Annie quite a bit, and they would talk about Annie, and Annie would come over to their house sometimes. But, a lot of the early suffragists did not want to go near her because she was an atheist. They really thought that was going to taint their movement. And I think I was surprised when I was looking at periodicals for the trial that, you'd have a small newspaper in Leeds or a small newspaper in Wales covering it, but the leading suffragist journal didn't. It wasn't even mentioned in it. And so Annie was sort of shunned out of that as well. And I wonder if there were some, I don't know, there was, Bob, you can tell us better than ever. Annie wasn't an entirely popular figure when she came into the NSS because some people felt she had jumped the queue, and that she had sort of won Charles's heart. And the only reason she was there is because they were an item and so forth. And I think when her popularity soared, some enmities came out. One poll had her right up there with, after Victoria and Florence Nightingale, as one of the most popular women or recognizable women in Great Britain.
Yeah, of course. It was always ferociously denied that there was anything more than a working relationship between Annie Besant and Charles Bradlaugh. But we have to remember that both were quite young people who were estranged from their respective partners.
Right.
And so that is a factor, I think.
Yeah.
Just going back to Holyoake versus Bradlaugh and the two versions, I think one thing you have to recognize about Bradlaugh is that he wasn't actually worried about respectable opinion. He was driven by the issues. That was what counted to him. Holyoake, though, was very much influenced. He always wanted to be respectable. He was always aspirant in that sense. He even used to go around to William Gladstone's house and take coffee or tea or whatever it was with him. And this was terribly important to Holyoake. So Holyoake was much more interested in courting respectable opinion and trying to find that as a route to pursue his views and the things that he wanted. Bradlaugh was far more confrontational.
Yeah, he's railing against the dwarf princes of the Germanic monarchy and so forth, yes. Right? Abolish all this. He could care less, right?
Yeah, I mean, Bradlaugh was the leading Republican of his era. He wrote this pamphlet, the impeachment of the House of Brunswick, which was a scathing attack.
I'm glad earlier, by the way, you had mentioned his working class roots. I think that was something, in some ways, Annie was more comfortable speaking to the special jury and the Lord Chief Justice on that stage than Bradlaugh was, because she had a polished, she had a posh way of speaking because she was privately educated and had well traveled and everything else, and then he wasn't.
Bradlaugh suffered from quite often people picking him up on his style of speaking. In particular, apparently, he dropped his H's, which is a terrible thing to do, of course, in respectable society.
Right. Well, so we're now past 8 o'clock, but I do want to continue, if that's all right. And thank you everyone who's sticking around, because I can see that there's still some questions coming in, and I do want to get through as many as possible because they are really good questions. So from John Bowler, why do you think the most vocal opposition to birth control and abortion comes from men?
That's the $1 million question. I always wonder, honestly, I'm like, what? Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I really don't. And it's amazing to me how in the US, for example, you saw during the pandemic, how many people will quickly say, like, you can't tell me, I have to wear a mask. It's my body. It's my choice. And it is the same people that will say that we have to strict, teaching of birth control in schools or anything else. Annie would say, and in Annie's inaugural debut speech on the London stage on the political status of women, she said, men are afraid of women becoming elected to positions of power, and they should be, because once women are elected, these laws are all going to go away. I think today she'd still look around and say, representation is certainly up, but it's not enough.
It's about control, isn't it, Michael?
Probably, yeah.
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 And using a morality to protect your own position.
I just wanted to give, there's two comments that we've had rather than questions, but they're both good. One, Ali Morris says, absolutely fantastic talk. Can't wait to buy the book. So thank you very much, Ali. And one from Stephen Lindsay. If anyone is interested, there is good coverage of Annie Besant in the People's History Museum. The National Museum of Democracy is based in Manchester. While in the city, you can visit Charles Bradlaugh's portrait in the Manchester Art Gallery. Thank you very much, Stephen. That's great information. So thank you.
I didn't know that was there, so that's good to know. Thank you, Stephen.
No, in the Manchester Art Gallery, there is William Sickert's portrait of Bradlaugh at the bar of the House of Commons. I think it was his third speech from the bar. He wasn't allowed into the House of Commons as such, but he was allowed on a number of occasions to stand just outside at the bar and address the assembled MPs. He was sort of regarded almost as a contagion. They had to keep a distance from him, I think. But Sickert was a great admirer of Bradlaugh. They were both rather iconoclastic in their... Sickert was an iconoclastic artist, and Bradlaugh was iconoclastic as far as his politics was concerned. He went places other people didn't dare go. And this portrait of Bradlaugh was painted shortly after Bradlaugh's death. And it was, in fact, the largest painting that William Sickert ever produced. And it's hanging in a very prominent position as you enter the Manchester Art Gallery, which is a splendid art gallery, I have to say. And I have to just drop in that the NSS had something to do with getting it hung there.
Stuart Ware is saying actually it's Walter Sickert, not William Sickert.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry.
Thanks, Stuart.
Sorry, yes, Walter, yes, sorry.
Let's see, there's a slightly long one here, but I think it's an important one, and it does touch on an issue that the NSS campaigns on as well these days. Did you find out anything about Annie's defence of the caste system? Presumably this is this might have been something in her time in India. Although it's amazing to see Annie's major role in defending free speech, fertility rights for women and women's rights in general during that era, her support for the caste system and her role in the formation of the Congress Party, which were anything but critical of the caste system, raises questions. And
there's a lot, I should say. I'm glad you pointed that out. And here's a tricky thing about writing a book about someone with as long a career with as many acts as Annie. She does not behave honorably in many ways after moving to India. There's a few, I mean, we can get into, the anointed one, the young boy that they decide to take custody of or guardianship of, which is scandalous itself. She was affiliated with a man who was accused of pedophilia. He was acquitted in court, but the accusations were certainly credible. She fell out with Gandhi. She thought his movement was ridiculous in many ways, and it was sapping support for her, or it wouldn't work. And you're right, of her defense of the caste system. And so I'm just going to say here that I drew a line as a writer of I just want to talk about her defense of free speech and this trial. And then you'll see in the book, I do touch on how this peak of her intellectual prowess and activism, sort of hits its nadir, as it were, when she's in India, especially choices she's making in the 1910s and onward. I didn't want to write a hagiography of Annie. I don't mean to do that in any way, and I don't want to dismiss the question, but I also realized that if I covered her entire biography, this was going to be a 700-page book that people didn't want to read. There are good books about Annie's time in India. There's several of them, in fact. And, you know, to your point here, I'm surprised she's venerated as much as she is in India. There's streets for Annie Besant all over the place in India. There's postage stamps for Annie in India. There's a Coast Guard ship named the Annie Besant in India that was launched a few years ago. And many Indian readers don't know about her birth control activism, but I think they do know about her, you know, her support for home rule, and her support, you know, her founding of what became Banaras Hindu University, where Nehru graduated from. But you're right, there's a lot of questionable things she does in India at the end of her life, and I'm not here to defend those.
No, I think that's great. It just shows that she's a human being, and yeah, it's a rounded person. I think.
Or maybe she should have stayed in the NSS.
Perhaps,
maybe foreigners shouldn't get involved in foreign cultures in which they don't speak the native language or have a full understanding of what's going on the ground, right? Like when you see her telling off Gandhi, and Gandhi, to his great credit, restrains himself, and after she passes, you know, he says nothing but pleasant things about her and says, "I'll always choose to remember the Annie Besant I knew as a fighter in London in the 1870s and 1880s." But, you know, she does lose some of her luster, if not much of it, I think, later in her life.
One of the interesting things in that connection was when she formally left the NSS, there was even a meeting at the Old Street Hall of Science to mark her departure. And it was, the descriptions I've read of it are quite interesting. There wasn't any anger. You might expect some degree of anger by these sort of principled people who felt betrayed. There was just a great deal of sadness and regret that she had decided to part company. And people try very hard to try and accommodate her, actually, and her shifting beliefs. Because Annie, unlike Bradlaugh, by the late 1880s, was going in the direction of socialism. Yeah. Bradlaugh didn't. He was an individualist. He was never a socialist. Yeah. And they could accommodate that. They could get past that one. But Theosophy was just a step too far. Yeah. And of course, that period, 1890 and 91, was a bit of a disastrous period for the NSS because Bradlaugh died very young, and Annie Besant left them. Yeah.
Another comment from Barathi MG on this. There was a movement in the same address during the time of Besant, a branch associated with the NSS which opposed the caste system. In a way, NSS was also opposing caste system more vehemently than any other during the 1880s, and certainly we still campaign to end casteism today as well, and end caste-based discrimination. So thanks, Barathi. Just another comment from Susan Munro. Great book. I really enjoyed it. And thank you for briefly mentioning Elizabeth Wollstonecraft Elmy as well. Yeah. So thank you, Susan. Question from Maddie Goodall. Such a brilliant talk. Thank you. Another amazing woman, Emma Martin, was a really prominent activist for a time before stepping into private practice as a midwife in her later life. She died in 1851. Her children, unlike Annie's, seemed to go in quite a different direction to her, becoming very religious, her having been an outspoken atheist. Did Annie's children, after rejoining her at 18, stay loyal and aligned to her?
That is such a great question. You know, Digby, her son. Okay, so Annie was supposed to be allowed to write to her children when they were in Reverend Besant. She changed her name, the pronunciation. She couldn't lose the name, but she changed it to kind of make it her own after she left him. So she became Besant, rhymes with pleasant, she said. It's really Besant. So Reverend Frank had the kids, and Annie was writing to them regularly, but she chose no longer to visit them because it was too painful. There was a court-appointed guardian that would follow them into the sea and so forth. The children were crying when she left. So she made the difficult decision to just say, I'm not going to see them anymore. And they came back when they were 18. But Annie would write to them. But it turned out that Reverend Frank was not giving them the letters. So they really were severed from their mother. So you can imagine when they came back at age 18, And she's this, a woman with a reputation, the worst thing you could be as a woman in Victorian England. It had to have been strained. It had to have been hard to sort of reintegrate the family unit. Digby did not become an activist. He became an accountant, apparently quite a good one, because in his Times obituary, he received an obituary in the Times of London as the son of Annie Besant. Mabel married a man who became a journalist and went off to Australia. They had a child, and then Mabel left him. He was yet another man in Annie's life that had become knighted. Her brother was knighted, her brother-in-law was knighted, her son-in-law was knighted, all by Victoria. Mabel came back, and they spent time together, but Mabel didn't follow her to India. She saw her in India, and Mabel sort of vanishes from the narrative, unfortunately. There was no Times obituary for her. And I don't know, Bob, you can tell me, I don't think she was a formal member of the NSS. By that point, Annie was leaving. And
oh, you muted, Bob. There we go.
I'm sorry, yes. No, I don't know what happened to her. I know that they were reunited, and they certainly visited Annie well into her old age in India. So they remained on good terms, but I don't know much about their attitudes, I'm afraid, to religion or anything else.
In the book, one of the sources I draw on in the British Library, there's an unpublished manuscript that someone found for me. And it's funny, you're reading it under George Bernard Shaw's bust, because Shaw's a character in this book, because he was quite smitten with Annie. But in this unpublished manuscript, it's Annie's niece, her brother, who became knighted and was the longtime secretary for the Royal Society of Arts. And he got to go to Cambridge after going to Harrow. He had the full education that Annie didn't get. His daughter, Frida Fisher, was very enamored of her Aunt Annie. And so she went and found the people that had worked with Annie at the height of her activism in London, including George Bernard Shaw. And he gives a great long interview about how marvelous Annie was and what a firebrand and so forth. And so rather than Mabel and Digby, I just would say the family member that I felt loved, or I felt wanted to remember her the most, was actually her niece. And then Bradlaugh's daughter, Hypatia, sort of became his amanuensis. His other daughter died younger, and Hypatia sort of carried the torch of Bradlaugh's memory and put together this remarkable archive of his papers that are at the Bishopsgate Institute. But unfortunately, Annie ordered all of her papers, correspondence, burned, and Charles ordered all of his correspondence, especially relating to Annie, burned. And so as a biographer, you're sort of reading between the lines with these people, but it's Hypatia, his daughter, and then, because she wrote 2 very good volumes of a biography of her father, and then the niece, Frida, that sort of were the family members, I think, that were closest to them, or at least their memory.
Thanks. Right, now I think we've got one more comment and then 2 questions, which I really wanted to save to the end and which I think are closely related, so I'll ask them together. So the comment is from Malcolm McQueen. Theosophists tend to ignore Besant's NSS involvement in the same way secularists ignore the connection to Theosophy, the study of comparative religions. It is good you are thinking about a modern biography. Thanks, Malcolm. And now these 2 final questions, which I thought were excellent, and I'll put them together. Nigel Skellen, how do you think Annie Besant would view and react to today's equality in our patriarchal society? And then an anonymous question, why do you think Annie's story isn't better known? Was she forgotten or repressed?
First question, I think, to bring this back to Benjamin Franklin, I think Annie would be amazing on Twitter/X. I think she'd be on all the Sunday news programs. I think she would be a great quote. She'd probably have a column in The Guardian. I think she'd be fantastic. And she wouldn't be surprised by anything. But she'd still be fighting that fight. Well, I should say the Annie of 1870s to 1880s, at least, right? The Annie of the 1890s onward might really decry the sort of moral rot, as she might think of it, or the lack of spirituality, which maybe isn't there or is there, I don't know. That's a great question about Annie. Why we don't remember her. And people ask me, like, what do you hope happens from this book? Well, of course, I want a biopic made. This is a Netflix series waiting to happen. I watched Scoop last night, and I thought, if we're spending 2 hours on Prince Andrew's Newsnight interview, why can't we learn about this woman who was pioneering in the fight for the right to access and learn about birth control? But I'd love to see a statue of Annie as well, and more recognition of her in modern British history, if not world history. That's a great question, though. Why? Where is it? Where's her story? I don't know the answer to that. Now, maybe Megan and Bob, you could weigh in as Brits. I mean, I'm an American coming in from the outside of this, so it's easy for me to say, why don't you Brits recognize, America's littered with dozens of figures like this. So could you answer that, either of you? Why do you think?
Well, we're just very bad at celebrating our own history as secularists, free thinkers, progressives, whichever term you want to use. We're very bad at celebrating this history. And it really is quite remarkable. Of course, the churches, the religious, are very good at it.
Good point.
I mean, they have this network of buildings all over the country which celebrate their history. And yet we don't seem to recognize the importance of this as part of an intellectual tradition, which we should do. And so we're partly to blame. I think another factor is that if you're talking about progressive politics and progressive ideas in this country, then there is one big player out there, or has been for a century or so, and that's called the Labour Party.
Yeah.
And the Labour Party, somebody once said, a general secretary, I think a fellow called Griffiths, said the Labour Party owes more to Methodism than Marx. Now, I'm sure it's absolutely right in that respect, but the interesting thing about that comment is that he doesn't mention Thomas Paine's Secularism, Bradlaugh, or any of that. They prefer to ignore it because within a movement that has many people are influenced by their religion, Christian socialism is a very important part of the Labour Party. I think they'd rather turn a bit of a blind eye to these 19th century freethinkers and atheists.
And Susan Munro has chipped in and says, we are very bad at celebrating women.
Yes.
Which I think that's a very, very fair point.
And I should say, people ask me, like, as an American, what surprised you the most? What surprised me the most is that the Victorian era certainly was not women lying back fainting on couches. I mean, that's sort of the image you have. And Virginia Woolf even wrote that the Victorian era was the age of the professional man. But you read into this and you start with Carolyn Norton and you go onward and you think, like, there are so many people who are raising their voices and trying to be heard on these issues, and they're still very much relevant today. I would love, there's that space I showed in the beginning of the slide on the Reformers Memorial there in Kensal Green. So if someone can get a chisel and just go in there and add Annie's name to that blank spot, that would be fantastic.
Brilliant. I think we will wrap it up. I just wanted to finish with another comment from Maddie Goodall. Thank you. Brilliant. Thank you all so much. Following on from the previous thanks and mention of Elizabeth Wolstenholme-Elmy, hero. Thank you for mentioning Sarah Chapman and her role in the Match Girl strike. Really great to hear that wider acknowledgement, and love the contextualization throughout. So brilliant. I think we will wrap up now. If anyone does have any further questions, please just email them to the NSS and we can pass them on to Michael, if that's all right.
Sure.
So just thank you very much to Michael Meyer for joining us tonight, and to Bob Forder as well for his insight. And thank you everyone for attending tonight and for your excellent questions. Anytime you want to get in touch with the NSS about anything, please do. And we hope to see you at a future NSS event soon. So thank you very much. Have a good evening. Bye.